Dobro večer in dobrodošli na prvem dogodku v letošnjem letu znotraj serije Pogovora in predavanj o afriški literaturi. Če je še relevantno, vsem voščim srečno, zdravo in pa predvsem bralno novo leto. Ob tem tudi napovedujem številne nove prevode afriških avtorjev, ki naj bi pri različnih založbah išle v letošnjem letu in ki jih bomo tudi znotraj serije posamično tudi predstavili. Danes pa bomo prvič znotraj serije govorili o maroški literaturi in o maroškem avtorju. Gre za Taharja Ben Jellouna, ki je leta 1987 prejel Goncourtovo nagrado za njegov roman Sveta noč. Ta roman je šel leta 2004 pri založbi Modrijan v prevodu Suzane Koncut. Roman je žal razprodan, ravno tako so razprodane tudi njegove druge 3 knjige, ki so išle v slovenščini, Ta slepeča odsotnost svetlobe, Domov in pa Otrok peska, ki je išel davnega 95. leta pri nas. Seveda to, da so knjige razprodane, je nek pokazatelj veličine pisatelja, ne le pri nas, ampak tudi nasplošno v širših sferah. Mimogrede moramo meniti, da je v Sloveniji, v slovenskem prevodu išla tudi njegov esej Kako sem hčerki razložil rasizem, gre pa tudi pravzaprav za neke vrste mladinsko literaturo. Tahar Ben Jelloun se je rodil v Maroku leta 1944, obiskoval je francosko-arabsko to bilingual šolo. Kasneje je študiral filozofijo na Univerzi v Rabatu in kasneje seveda tudi kot študent nekako je bil tudi precej aktivističen, sodeloval je pri literarni reviji in potem tudi kasneje sodeloval pri študentskem uporu proti tedanji represivni vlogi maroške policije in leta 1966 bil primoran nekaj časa preživeti v military camp kot neko kazen za to. Kasneje je potem tudi doktoriral v Franciji iz socialne psihiatrije leta 1975. Danes je znana ne le po svoji literarni karieri, ampak tudi kot kolumnist in nek komentator o izkušnjah severnoafričanov, ki živijo v Franciji. Danes so z menoj Suzana Koncut, ki mislim, da jo ne rabimo posebej predstavljati, je večkrat nagrajena prevajalka iz francoščine in prevedla je tudi dela Taharja Ben Jellouna. Poleg mene je Grega Ulen, doktorski študent primerjalne književnosti na Princeton University in pa Loubna Belmekki, doktorska kandidatka na univerzi v Fesu oziroma Sidi Mohamed Ben Abdellah University v Maroku. Tako da dobrodošli vsi. Jaz bom sedaj, dogodek bo potekal v angleščini, tako da mislim, da bom zdaj tale jezikovni obrat naredila. So thank you everyone for attending this event and I have no doubt that we're going to have a fruitful discussion. Suzana, maybe if we start with you, since you have translated his work, and I believe translating one author and several of his books, it means some type of I believe you established some kind of intimate relationship with the author and his works. So you are not only in the role of a reader, but also in the role of interpreter, right? So what is in your opinion the position of Tahar Ben Jelloun in the world literature, and what is your personal relationship to his writing?
No, I have to tell that for me, this translating Tahar Ben Jelloun was a really important phase, because in fact this was my first book, not the La Nuit Sacrée, but the other one, L'Enfant du Sable, the child of the sand, or how would you say? I don't know what is the English translation title. That was the first book that I went with to Mladinska knjiga to propose as my first literal translation. And in fact, in that time, it was, I don't know anymore, it was the beginning of 90s. At that time, Tahar Ben Jelloun was famous enough in France that the editor who became my really faithful editor, was ready to accept the proposition of a really young and beginner translator and put the book on the program of the eminent Slovenian editing house. It was already after the Goncourtovo, and in fact, I considered that L'Enfant du Sable is more, for me, it was more aesthetically more important book and more interesting also in the way how it was written. So that was the first one to be translated in Slovenia, and I remember that even the first lecture, the professional lecture in the editing house, was so fascinated about that book that she, the one that was making corrections, that she tried to find me and to say that this was really the best book that she read for I don't know how many years. So the book, this L'Enfant du Sable, came at the right moment. It was that was still the period of the fascination for the South American magic realism, and Tahar Ben Jelloun was somehow he connected his writing to this let's say movement, no, and. It's also, for me, it was quite a fact that those two books, La Nuit Sacrée and L'Enfant du Sable, were somehow bringing his writing to more acceptable form, because before he was, in fact, he was a poet, and all of his prose book were sort of a poetic prose, which was quite modernist and quite hard for to read. You know. It was not an easy literature, and then he started to somehow polish the writing to be accepted by the European readers mostly. And I have to admit that I was fascinated precisely by that. But this. He was somehow leading the European writer through the, let's say, Moroccan legends way of also this tradition of the counter, of the one who is telling the story, the storyteller, and this kind of a poetic mixture with the prose. Yeah.
All right, I think we're going to get back to some things that you mentioned a bit later, but maybe a question for Grega, and just to give some type of the background for the better understanding of the author. Tahar Ben Jelloun writes in French language, right? Although his mother tongue is Maghrebi Arabic, if I'm correct. You can... Sorry? Okay, you can speak on about it, right? And like in January 2003, like he was nominated one of the two candidates for the 16th seat of the French Academy, which like is the institution of some type of safeguarding and moderating body of French language, right? His seat was last held by Senghor, and he was actually the first African to. Despite his relation to negritude, he was actually part of French Academy. So how do you see this, Grega? Like, is the language, the question about language still relevant in contemporary, or maybe just in his case, you know, because usually when we speak about the language, I'm not really, I must say, like I'm not an expert on the North African literature, but like what I know from this question and the issue with the literature, I know mostly from the other part of the Africa. So can you speak a bit more about that?
Loubna, did you want to say something about the Tarja? Yeah, I think it's such an eminent post-colonial question. Language, right? and the way that that entire theoretical discussion has been framed in terms of writing in the colonizer's language and the both ethical questions, questions of domination that obviously get reproduced through language as well, both in terms of expressing particular cultural context through a language that is perceived as foreign to a specific cultural locale, but also the very, real political implications of using a language which has been used to dominate and colonize a collective people and subjugate their cultural collective existence. I think in North Africa, in Maghreb, that question has been even more, let's say, acute than in other parts of Africa. And when Suzana mentioned that Tahar Ben Jelloun started off as a poet, he was also part of the avant-garde collective in the 60s, started by Abdellatif Laabi, called Souffle, Ansaf, Breaths, I think. And it was a kind of literary poetic magazine, which also saw itself as a kind of political avant-garde. Later on, after 67, I think the entire poetic political project went in more revolutionary ways, and the kind of question of aesthetic revolution was also combined with the question of the political revolution. And I think also particularly a lot of Maghrebi writers have come up with interesting, let's say, have produced interesting discussions about this question of language, and not only in, I think, the question of domination and the kind of negativity, but also in relations of erotics and love. I think another Moroccan writer was Abdelkabir Khatibi, who also wrote these bilingual configurations. I think L'amour bilingue was one thing, and yeah, really questioning this, I guess, kind of mechanical idea that, you have your own one particular language that's your mother tongue, versus another language that is imposed on you and that is necessarily always foreign, and that you can't express yourself authentically through it. And I think these questions remain with us today, of course. I guess the situation is much different also because of how the world literary market has become homogenized, how you get access to literatures from particular parts of the world through translation, and then also how particular writers write, for translation in many cases. Yeah, maybe that's enough for now.
Yes, I mean, as a start, Mr. Tahar Ben Jelloun considers himself a French writer, and he believes that a writer is defined by the language he or she writes in, rather than the nationality. And hence, he goes further in explaining that as a French national, he objects being labeled as a francophone, and he considers himself a French writer, and he likes to be a French writer, and not to be referred to as a francophone, or to subcategorize his writing as foreign language or foreign literature. And this is like the general what he believes as a writer. As about his profile like in Morocco, how is he perceived. I would say there are two categories in Morocco. There are the ones who actually read his books and admire him and cherish his literature and the success he achieves. However, there is also a category of Moroccans who do not like his work, for they believe that he portrays Morocco as a folklorian image, or they write in an exotic manner, and that he doesn't portray Morocco as it is. And this is somehow controversial. And this is like why Moroccans somehow are frowned upon his literature. And although he's very famous, I mean, everyone knows who Tahar Ben Jelloun is. However, his literature and his works are not quite admired by the Moroccan public in general, of course, only with exception. So, yeah.
I was maybe just add something. I mean, for me, these objections were quite a surprise when I first went to Morocco and I started to talk about, wow, you know, Tahar Ben Jelloun, you really have a great writer. And when some Moroccan friends started to express some doubts about that. And in fact, only then I found out that a lot of people there were commenting his writing as not really dealing with the Moroccan reality, and that in fact that the question that he's including in his book are not the real political or social dilemmas of our time. But in fact, for me, this was. I think that still there is this social critics that is included in his work about the gender roles, about the position of the woman, about I don't know, the individuality of the person in Islamic world. But it's true now that he is treating these questions in a very poetic way that somehow is. How would I say, hiding the social and the political sharpness of it.
Maybe I'll just add something. Excuse me. Yeah, I think, because I mean, everywhere in the 20th century, but particularly in colonial and post-colonial contexts, literature was always so highly politicized. And then, you know, basically everywhere you had the different bifurcations, but often the kind of socialist, realist tradition of representing life as it really was, in particular, you know, in contrast to colonizing representations from the occupier. And so, and then, like Suzana mentioned, the more poetic, less, you know, less representational, maybe, modes were often frowned upon as not political enough in that sense. And just the other point I wanted to add, I think the question of cultural nationalism really played an important role in the development of aesthetics, because that's when all of these questions of authenticity really get you know, foundational to literature. And then the writer is always expected to, you know, represent his or her culture as it is, which one can say can then become schematic and dogmatic.
I would go further in saying that he has also been accused of Orientalism, and that he writes from an Orientalistic perspective, in which that he has gave in for European French like culture, and that he writes what they want, and he doesn't actually represent Morocco as it is. And the fact that he immigrated to France like in the 70s, and maybe he's not up to date to life in Morocco as it is now, or what's going on. And even when with his gender representation, how he portrays women, somehow he insists on representing them like back in the past. He did not update the role of women like in his literature, and mostly he still writes about women like in the 70s or even like in the period of colonialism. We have not seen something revolutionary or something very authentic to some extent in his literature and his productions so far. So that's what's needed, at least, to be known. More literature and more spotlight on life in Morocco as it is now, and not like in the 70s and all the problems that have happened, especially during that period. Like in Morocco, it was pretty politicized, and that it was under a lot of like transitions, political and social transitions. So yes.
Okay, thank you. You all mentioned these categories of gender and representation of women. And before we go to the book, The Sacred Night, which is translated Sveta Noć in Slovene, this is the book. There is a pre-context, right? The pre-context of this book is the book Sand Child, right? Which was published in 1985. And this novel actually expressed the idea about, okay, post-colonial condition of Morocco, while at the same time focusing on the construction of individual identities. And there is already, like, you know, some critique of traditional Islamic and Moroccan morals, and there is a reference to position of women. So, Grega, could you speak a bit more about this book and the gender relations in it and all that? Yeah.
Okay, I just checked the time so that I don't go on for too long. I really like this novel. I think it's really interesting, and like Suzana said, though I must admit I have not read the La Nuit Sacrée, but from what I've heard about it, okay, so maybe let me just say a little bit about the book. It opens with character of Hajj, a respected man who has had 7 children, all daughters, and he desperately wants a son because, you know, in all patriarchal cultures, which are all cultures, men are favored, and he decides when his wife is pregnant for the 8th time, I believe, he says the child will be a man, even if she is a girl. And that is precisely what happens. Hajj's wife gives birth to ostensibly a daughter. And I think already there, right at the beginning, we have this sort of irresolvable dilemma, because the narrator, who is an unreliable narrator throughout the book, tells us that the child was a girl, and yet the father says, oh, look, it's a boy. It has, you know, testicles and a penis, and I finally got a boy that I wanted. And I think throughout the novel, there's this resistance to kind of declaring the truth about sex, right? The kind of resistance to saying, you know, here, this is unequivocally the child's genitals look this way, and that's what, you know, is defines the subject as male or female. Then this daughter's breasts get bound. There's a ritual of sham circumcision, which is, you know, there's a lot of different interpretations of the novel. There's a way in which it sort of follows the child, a girl, growing up as a boy, as with a kind of false identity that she needs to hide, and develops a masculine identity that she then reproduces the violence through which he is raised, so that masculinity is asserted and really inculcated into his body. But I think there is a kind of allegory of gender that happens throughout, right? A kind of destabilizing of kind of gender, or even a kind of biological reality of sex, because Ahmed, as the boy is named, instead of Zahra, which is the sort of birth name given to the girl, there are these constant references from different social actors that he needs to become a real man, right? And the way in which nature always needs to be sort of modified by culture, if we're talking in those very binary terms. Not only kind of across the gender binary, right? We have a daughter who needs to become a real man, but I think even in terms of, right, when we have a little boy, we already need to circumcise him so that he actually becomes a true man, right? I think this kind of truth of sex and reality of biology is constantly subverted and questioned throughout these encounters that Ahmed has throughout the novel. I picked some quotes, but I don't know if I should. I think also linguistically, this is what's really interesting for me in the novel. Okay, maybe I'll just mention one point when Ahmed says, it's moi et un autre, moi et une autre. There's this kind of triangulation, right? It's like there's me, there's the I, the whatever subject I am, and then I am being constructed as an other, like a masculine other, and then a feminine other. And it's both are sort of foreign to me because I, as a complicated embodied subject, I have to do violence to myself to slot myself into a particular gendered category that society wants me to become. Yeah, I could maybe add in terms of like literary historical context, this magical realist or postmodernist, however we want to use those categories. I think Tahar Ben Jelloun does a really good job in sort of vernacularizing those kinds of, there's always a question of, are we imposing, or like, is he importing foreign literary styles or formal devices, or are they actually being born from within a specific cultural context? Because the kind of postmodernist devices that he uses, this kind of instability of language, instability of narration, also come from, North African oral narrative traditions. We have the narrator that we've mentioned already before, and this kind of sequence of narrators, which is also like an Islamic trope. And then there's obviously the entire novel is very political in different aspects, but like a very naked reality of politics comes in at the end when our storyteller stops giving the narration, and the novel says, then there was a kind of urban reconstruction. The technocratic elite came in and reconstructed the city, and the old urban, what was it? I don't have this. Like an urban square where the community would hang out and tell stories and listen to stories, and other people would contribute to this narration as well. Then this was converted into a musical fountain, right? And then we have this like new kind of urban modernity coming in, and the narrative itself falls apart. And then the way the novel ends is with different people in a cafe sort of guessing what could have happened to Ahmed after the storyteller stops giving this supposedly authoritative account. And so I think the kind of like very interesting literary modes in which the novel is told are very strongly related to the kind of traditional modes of narration and narrativity.
Which also brings different point of view, different, or somehow the construction of the story with different, let's say, hypotheses of it, and deconstruct it. And for me, this was probably one of the best formal part of the novel.
Loubna, can you maybe elaborate a bit about the gender identity, which is also like, what Grega has said, like the story continues in the novel The Sacred Night, right? And gender identity, Moroccan girl raised as a boy, is very important, right? And there is inheritance, love, and so on. So since you are also like your work is mostly, like academic work is mostly focused on the culture and gender. So can you elaborate a bit more about that, and why is it so important in Moroccan context, and mostly like how can we position it in the country, in the culture?
Gender identity in Morocco, I think, being like a patriarchal society, and most, as you said, in most patriarchal societies, it is preferred, or it is more considered a privilege to have a male child over female children, because first, male children, they carry on the family's name, and somehow this seems like important, or it adds value to the family. And there is also the question of inheritance, because the male child tend to inherit like the most of the inheritance. And it's quite problematic, and it is still problematic like till now, especially this inheritance, but this is not the focus. I will focus on the fact that in most patriarchal societies, people tend to favor men over women, especially like when you already have female daughters, of course, eventually you would like to have a male child. And because we will come here to the concept of shame. And in most patriarchal societies, especially Muslim ones, women tend to carry either honor of the family or shame. And hence having women, there's always this idea that we should raise our daughters well, so that she will make the family proud. And of course, there shouldn't be any form of like misbehaving or acting in a way that is considered immoral. And this idea of whole shame, it's always based upon women. And it is quite ironic, because why men are so entitled to this idea of honor, that they base it on female and not on male, or just like on people generally. Why this idea of gender very, very important and very prevalent. And at the same time, male generally enjoy more rights, and they have more privileges in Moroccan society, or like Muslim societies. And this position, it didn't came like between a night and morning, but it has been inherited since like the beginning of history, and it hasn't changed a lot. And at the same time, culture as well as mentalities are the one that contribute in the perpetuation of this male superiority over women. And as for religion, it came to my conclusion that it's a matter of interpretation rather than the sacred text per se. And most interpretation of religious texts were made by male scholars, especially male elite, and they were the ones to have the right to say what's right and what is wrong, and they were the ones to make men hold like a superior position in society and women like inferior position. However, this is changing now, of course, especially that a lot of women now are taking over the religious text and they are contributing in the interpretation, and they want to establish their own narratives. And this is quite an optimistic step, and a lot of people are basing like the laws eventually they will change and they will entail this equality between the genders. And at the same time, for example, in the Moroccan society, under the constitution, under law, both men and women are equal. However, when it comes to the practice, when it comes to culture, to society, that's when praxis is totally else. Like the narratives are totally else. And as I said, it's hard to change mentalities and the way culture is practiced, because it doesn't take just to change law, but it should be that this implementation of laws and that people would be more comfortable with this concept of equality, and that not to be like frowned upon, and that people will be afraid to talk about equality and everything. And Tahar Ben Jelloun, he, in his novel, like L'Enfant du Sable, he has succeeded in portraying this idea through the way that the Hajj wanted to raise his 8th daughter as a male child, because the child will carry the name, the family name, as well as because of the inheritance, because he didn't want his brother to take the inheritance, and that's why he insisted on the fact on raising his daughter as a male for these purposes. So, yeah.
You know, I generally believe that when a writer, you know, writes their novel, especially writers that are not maybe positioned in Europe, or their way of writing is not related to Europe, you know, they're not obliged, you know, how people and how the readers are like understanding their work, it's not up to them. I think this is some type of position that most writers hold. But at the same time, while reading this book, like I've been constantly asking myself, like, you know, you have mentioned that there is a part of Moroccan population that does not, that don't like his writing, and that, you know, their critique is that it does not portray Moroccan in the way it is. So I was always keeping in mind, like, how can a European reader actually understand this book, you know? So, of course, like, you know, a writer cannot dictate what a reader understands, but is there any type of, like, way how to actually read these like the novels that deal with the gender identity or the gender category? You know, my concern is actually that, you know, while we are reading such thing, we are also producing and reinforcing the stereotypes. So what is your belief on that? I mean, like, what is your stand, actually?
I believe that anything shouldn't be consumed vehemently without, like, sense of like, self-criticizing, or... Because, of course, I have no power over who reads the books, but... you cannot just believe whatever you read, though. You have to do your own research, and you have to, of course, read and see other sources, and don't base whatever you have about a country or gender on just one source or one book or one writer. But you should have this, like, diverse sources, but at the same time, you should try and take part of culture, like traveling. Traveling actually makes you know more about people and makes you know more about culture. I mean, that's what actually most people get surprised, for example, when they come to Morocco and, I don't know, they expect to see like sand or like camels right away. But no, this is not the thing. Like, of course, life has evolved from that period. And sometimes they get disappointed because they don't find sand and camels and, I don't know, women in haik or in niqab. And this is quite interesting because like you should stop holding people to stereotypes and a set of images that you have, you are trying to build, you see? And as I said, just like have diverse resources and don't believe whatever you read or whatever you see, and just have this sense of like critique in order to really understand the thing and to understand culture and to understand this dynamicity in literature generally.
Can I just add, as a student of literature, you know, art is complicated and doesn't directly it's not like literature is not ethnography. It's something that people don't quite recognize in, you know, so-called non-Western literary narratives. It's a kind of I think people often today still read you know, foreign literatures anthropologically as if, you know, they're coming at a novel in order to learn something about the true nature of a society that's not one's own. And of course, there's a dimension of that that's encoded in, you know, all sorts of cultural representations. But like Loubna's mentioned, yeah, it's, you know, I mean, people may or may not be surprised by how much a thing like 1001 Nights still remains, you know, crucial cultural text for people thinking about the Arab world or something like that.
I would maybe just try to see the continuation. Somehow I would say that those two books are still staying on the level of some legends, of some marvelous work, and some fantastic also, and L'Enfant du Sable and La Nuit Sacrée. Maybe even La Nuit Sacrée goes more to the reality with the first prvosebni pripovedovalec, with the Zahra, who is finally telling her own story. But it's still, as you said before, on the level of folkloric presentation of the society, of this habits. Like we could also talk about Virgina in Albania, who had more or less the same role. The girls that were raised as men to be to continue the family inheritance. So it's not only Morocco; it's the phenomenon that is quite general. Not general. You can find it elsewhere. But what I would say that for me, the work of Tahar Ben Jelloun became more problematic when he was really treating the questions that were closer to the reality. As for example, in the 2011, he wrote two books that were talking about the spring, Arab Spring. One was directly the story of the Tunisian seller who burned himself, and the other one was somehow the what was it already? Étincelle. It was the title was directly referred to to the Arab Spring, where he tried to made a sort of analysis from different North African countries, what is the political situation and what are the possibilities of the revolution. And on the other side, he put Morocco, that he was somehow where he was saying that there is no need for revolution because the situation is much more democratic. They are more advanced compared to Libya, Tunisia, or Egypt. And in that case, you could really see that he had a, how say, partial, not only partial, but really very somehow, yeah, politically incorrect position. And this was for me much more problematic. And I think that was the time that for me I stopped to follow his work. It's much more, it would be better to stay on on the more artistic.
So Suzana would recommend to read his previous works, right? Yes. Okay, this is the reading reference. But Grega, thank you for your comment. It's very valuable. Grega, he was also imprisoned, right, for a while. So, you know, writers in prison, it's somehow, it's not so unusual, right? So there is, what can you talk about the prison literature? There is like the history has shown us many cases of this phenomena.
Yeah, I guess artists speaking truth to power end up in jail. But I think, and I think you're referring to the book that we haven't said out loud yet, Set avec l'absence de lumière, the yeah, which is a very interesting text as well, drawing on his own prison experience, but also enunciating a kind of collective experience of imprisonment that scholars of Arabic literature have started theorizing as a kind of subgenre over the past decades, prison literature in particular. And maybe just briefly what I would say we encounter in a lot of prison texts, let's say, is again a kind of postmodernist sensibility, which again isn't a purely like textual device, but it's just a kind of aesthetic mode of attempting to represent a kind of total dissolution of, you know, a social world and subjectivity in prison, which is encountering terrible, horrendous types of torture, and you know, a kind of loss of humanity. And then the other thing that I would really add, there's an incredible preoccupation with language in general, and perhaps writing a bit more narrowly, though less so much the question of writing in this particular novel. But we often have writers in prison or elsewhere tend to write and sort of link their subjectivity to the very process of writing. And I think in this novel there's you know, a kind of way of retaining their humanity. The prisoners really, you know, engage in these sorts of like reflections on language, both in the kinds of sounds and the graphic forms of like letters. It's all very like oniric and magical realist again. The way sort of language, actually shapes their material reality, like language as a materiality when you're in a small, crowded cell with no light, with a blinding absence of light, and all you have left is a language that you're using to create or sustain a world for yourself. And I was going to add something else. Right, and I guess, your link with the outside world and things like that. I think also it has a strong, like prison literature also has a strong, documentary function, or like a testimonial form, which, as I just talked about, the kind of ethnographic readings of literature, right? Often these sorts of novels are also used as a kind of documentation of these terrible injustices, of these mass imprisonments and labor camps and things like that. So I think was it the Tazmamart is how it was called, the prison? Like there's a large literature around that in Morocco in particular, but we encounter it everywhere in the world with, autocratic regimes.
Just about his years in prison, because there were many people put in the prison during that time. It was called Years of Lead in Morocco. It lasted like 3 decades, from the 62 till 93, and like he marched in this student strike. They were actually trying to change many things, like in Moroccan society, especially like the regime, and there were many attempts to for a coup d'état and to bring down like the system, the regime, and there was also like propagation of the Marxist Lenin thought in Morocco during that time, and of course with the monarch Hassan II, he didn't give chance to any of this to happen, and anyone who explicitly delivered an opinion which is different from what's going on or what is prevalent, of course, they were imprisoned. And at the same time, this period of Morocco was one of the blackest, darkest eras in Morocco, but eventually the king, Hassan II, he tried to reconciliate between the people, and he even called for leaders of the socialist movement in Morocco to gather and to reform the constitution and everything. And eventually, with the succession of the new king, Mohammed VI, in the throne, he eventually recompensated for the years of these prisoners, and he recompensated also their families, and many people were hopeful about this new king who succeeded to the throne, and how many things have changed with him, and even till now, many people are quite optimistic about his reign and rule. And he tried not to commit the mistakes that his father did, and this is quite intriguing. And at the same time, he succeeded in his strategy as well. So yeah.
Yeah, maybe just that it's still a novel. It's not a documentary literature. It's not really talking about political reasons about why. I mean, it's mentioning the political reasons about why those prisoners are in this terrible prison, but somehow he's not really putting under question the king or his way of governing. I mean, this is in a certain way giving the beauty to the book, because it's more or less the. It's a bit simplifying. It's a spiritual how would say, development of the prisoner, which is the only way that he can survive. But it's again in the same way. Probably a lot of people would criticize that he didn't touch the reasons of the imprisonment.
I suggest I read one chapter from the book The Sacred Night, just so the audience online can get a feeling how he sounds in Slovene translation, which was done by Suzana. So it goes like this, I quote. Pomembna je resnica. Zdaj, ko sem stara, lahko živim z vso mirnostjo. Govorila bom, odložila besede in čas. Počutim se nekam težka. Najtežje niso leta, ampak vse, kar ni bilo izrečeno. Vse, kar sem zamolčala in prikrila. Nisem vedela, da lahko spomin, poln tišin in zaustavljenih pogledov, postane vreča peska, ki otežuje hojo. Dolgo časa sem potrebovala, da sem prišla do vas, prijatelji dobrega srca. Trg je še vedno okrogal. Kakor norost. Nič se ni spremenilo. Niti nebo, niti ljudje. Vesela sem, da sem končno tukaj. Vi ste moja odrešitev. Svetloba v mojih očeh. Moje gube so lepe in številne. Tiste na čelu so sledi in preizkušnje resnice. Ubranost časa so. Tiste na hrbtni strani dlani so črte usode. Glejte, kako se križajo. Zaznamujejo poti sreče, rišejo zvezdo, potem, ko je padla v jezersko vodo. Tu je zapisana zgodba mojega življenja. Vsaka guba je stoletje, cesta v zimski noči, bister izvir v meglenem jutru, srečanje v gozdu, razdor, pokopališče, požigalsko sonce. Ta guba tu, na hrbtni strani leve dlani, je brazgotina. Smrt se je nekega dne ustavila in mi nekako ponudila svojo roko. Morda zato, da bi me rešila. Odrinila sem jo in je obrnila hrbet. Vse je preprosto, če se le ne lotiš speljevati toka reke iz njene struge. V moji zgodbi ni ne veličine, ne tragičnosti. Samo nenavadna je. Premagala sem vse grobosti, da bi si zaslužila stras in postala uganka. Dolgo sem hodila po puščavi, prekrižala sem noč in ukrotila bolečino. Spoznala sem pronicljivo krutost najlepših dni. Dni, v katerih je vse videti spokojno. Prijatelji dobrega srca, kar vam bom zaupila, je podobno resnici. Lagala sem, ljubila sem in izdajala. Prečkala sem deželo in stoletja. Velikokrat sem sprejela izgnanstvo, samotno sredi samotnih. V starosti sem prestopila nekega jesenskega dne, ko sem obraz vrnila otroštvu ali tisti nedolžnosti, za katero sem bila prikrajšana. Spomnite se, bila sem otrok negotove in omahujoče identitete. Bila sem hči zakrinkana po volji očeta, ki se je čutil ponižanega, osramočenega, ker ni dobil nobenega sina. Kot veste, sem bila sin, o katerem je sanjal. Nekateri med vami poznate nadaljevanje, drugi ste sem in tja slišali odlomke. Včasih so tiste, ki so si upali pripovedovati o življenju tega otroka, peska in vetra, doletele neprijetnosti. Nekateri so izgubili spomin, drugi bi skoraj izgubili dušo. Pripovedovali so vam zgodbe. To niso zares moje zgodbe. Tudi kadar sem bila zaprta in ločena od ljudi, so me novice dosegle. Niso me niti presenetile, niti vznemirile. Vedela sem, da bom z izginotjem za seboj pustila dovolj snovi za najbolj nesmiselne pripovedke. A ker moje življenje ni pripovedka, sem hotela obnoviti prava dejstva in vam predati skrivnost zakopano pod črnim kamnom v hiši z visokimi zidovi na dnu ozke ulice, ki jih zapira 7 vrat. So, yeah, he's very poetic, right, and allegorical, and maybe we don't have enough time to speak particularly about his magical realism and so on, but since we are somehow we should conclude this event. I know the topic is wide and complex and we can go on, but maybe since we also somehow We have drawn like the idea about Tahar Ben Jelloun 2 books, but we were also critical. But mostly because this series is also meant for the promotional book, and I believe he is extremely good author. We should conclude this event by some concluding points why we should actually read him, and I still believe he's an excellent writer.
Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of complexity with which he treats, subjecthood and gender in the L'Enfant du Sable in particular, I've already talked about that. But I think contradictoriness is what is a mark of good literature, right? So, I mean, so that's one point, and the other one is it's good that we also critically evaluated his entire opus and said the good and the bad. But yeah, I would say I think the ways in which he leaves. He resists closure in some of the novels. He resists this kind of absolute knowledge, is what attracts me personally about his writing.
So no one can deny the fact that Tahar Ben Jelloun has excelled in his French literature and his themes in writing and everything, and eventually actually he succeeded in his literal and intellectual project, and that's quite remarkable. And the fact that he was awarded the Goncourtovo prix, which is the Goncourt prize, shows how excellent he is as a writer, and especially in terms of his writing. We call it in French auteur maghrébin d'expression française, which translates to writers with the French expression, and he succeeded in that. And he should more give an up-to-date image about Morocco and not focus on the past, because we no longer live there. So yeah, thank you.
No, I mean, what was most fascinating for me, it was really the beauty of the language that he uses. Now, he's not molesting French language like a lot of writers, écrivains d'expression française, were doing in certain with certain revenge spirit. He's not doing this, but he's really. How would I say? He's he shows all the beauties of the language, of the French language, I think. Yeah.
And maybe reinventing, right? Like using what he's getting and refusing to cede French language to some sort of ideal community of French citizens, and to say we all are heirs to language, and it's up to us to make it better, make it new, make it strange.
All right, so thank you, Suzana, Loubna, and Grega. My concluding comment should be, although the book is sold out, actually all the books, the libraries are full, and you should get and read some of his, as Suzana suggests, older books, This is important, yeah. So thank you so much for following the event, and thank you guys for attending it, and your comments were really valuable, and they somehow call for the further discussion. So thank you so much.